All right, Shabbos, say good morning. I'm sorry for the few-minute delay. Let us begin with a beautiful, beautiful daf ahead of us today on this special Lag BaOmer. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Iyar, Yonah, and Shoshi Ehrenfeld for dedicating the Shiurim and Drushos this month in memory of their grandfather Yosef ben Shmuel Aaron. Benjamin and Elise Wall for dedicating the Shiurim and Drushos this month in memory of Moshe Chaim ben Tzi Hirsch, Zichron Livracha. Our week of learning sponsors, Dr. Shmuel and Rabin Karapkin, in the commemoration of the first yahrzeit of Rabbi Shmuel's mother, Lipa ben Yecheskel HaKohen. And our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Seth and Rachel Rotenberg, in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Seth's father, Ze'ev ben Chaim Shmuel, Zichron Livracha, and Moshe and Yocheved Roth in honor of the marriage of their daughter Michal to Maya Reisher in Meretz Hashem, which will take place tonight. B'sha'a tova u'mitzlachos. We wish the Roths incredible Mazel Tov and the Chassan and Kala Hatzlacha as they build their Bayis Ne'eman B'Yisrael. We hope all of the Neshamos will have an Aliyah, all of the families in Nechama. And also with that, let us begin. A lot to do today, Baruch Hashem. A really incredible daf. Hopefully we'll have a few minutes at the end to talk a little bit about Lag BaOmer as well in Meretz Hashem, but let us begin. So today's daf is Ayin Gimel 73. We are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Ayin Beis Amud Beis 72b, and we're picking up pretty much in the middle of the daf. Amar Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar says, so this is pretty much, if you look at Tosis, so this Tosis Shemuter, right across from there. Almost right across from there, about 2 lines down. Amar Rabbi Elazar. Arel Shehiza Haza Asok Shera. So we'll say an interesting halacha. So remember, yesterday we spoke about that if a person is an Arel, they can be sprinkled with the water of the Para Aduma. So we explained essentially with the Chiddush of that statement was that you might have thought that purification could only take place if it's absolute. But let's say if a person is Tamei, Tumas Meis, and also is an Arel, even if you take care of the Tumas Meis, there's still the Arelos, right? And the Arelos ultimately, again, should go ahead and Havamim should preclude a person from becoming Tahar, Kamash Malon, though. Kamash Malon, that halacha lemaisa, even if you're an Arel, if you go ahead and you get sprinkled by the waters of the Para Aduma, ultimately, again, you are good to go. Shabbos say Rabbi Elazar now has not the opposite case, but a parallel case, which is that here in this case, the Arel is the one doing the sprinkling. You have a Kohen who's an Arel who's sprinkling the waters of the Para Aduma. So Rabbi Elazar, Arel Shehiza, Haza Asok Shera. So if an Arel does the Hazah, his sprinkling is kosher. The Gemara says, Midi Tahavile Atvul Yom. Because this is comparable to a Tvul Yom. So remember again, who's the Tvul Yom? Tvul Yom is a person who's Tameh, went to the mikvah, right, and is waiting for Harav Shemesh, just waiting for nightfall. It's called the Tvul Yom. So listen to Tvul Yom. Sha'af api sha'aser b'truma, kasher b'para. Because we'll say at the end of the day, a Tvul Yom, even though a Tvul Yom is not permitted to go ahead and eat truma, it's not permitted to eat aser b'truma, but he's mutter, it's permitted for him to participate in Para Aduma. So the Gemara says, Sha'af api sha'aser b'truma, kasher b'para, Malitvul Yom Shekin Mutter B'Maiser. So says the Gemara, I don't understand. What about a Tvul Yom that's mutter to go and eat Maiser, right? And we know about said that an Arel is not permitted to consume Maiser. So isn't the comparison flawed? So the Gemara says Atu Anan La'achila Ka'aminon. We're not talking about consumption. What are we talking about? Anan L'Negia Ka'aminon. Ultimately, again, what are we referencing? What are we referring to? We're referring over here to negia, to touching. And there's a fundamental distinction ultimately between consumption and contact. Umat tvul yom sha'aser b'negia the truma mutter bepara. So we'll say if you have a tvul yom who's not permitted to touch truma, yet ultimately he is permitted to participate in para aduma, arel shemutter b'negia eino din shemutter bepara. Then we'll say alachas kama v'kama an arel who is mutter to go ahead and touch truma. Again, eat it, but can go ahead and touch it, ultimately, again, is permitted to participate in para aduma. And Rabbi say, by the way, just to understand, the level of participation that's being described here is a heightened level of participation. Remember, again, this is the actual, being the actual sprinkler of the waters of the para aduma. So therefore, again, this is Rabbi Lazar's statement that an orel is permitted to go ahead and sprinkle the waters of para aduma. So Tanya Nami Hachi that supports this. Orel shehiza haza asal kshera. Ultimately, if an orel goes in and sprinkles water of para aduma, the sprinkling is kosher. Not only that, umaisa haya. This happened. V'chshiru chachamim haza asal, and the chachamim declared ultimately that the sprinkling of the Kohen orel ultimately will work. I will say it's interesting, by the way. It's interesting, if you think about it, like what does that last line add? Right, so we have something that Rabbi Lazar says that an Orel is permitted to go ahead and do the sprinkling. The Gemara then quotes a Braisa, Orel who did sprinkling, the sprinkling is kosher, and then the Gemara says, by the way, it happened. So of course we'll say we know, because halacha l'maisa, there's a difference between discussing abstract halacha and actual events that occurred. So the ability to go ahead and say, here's a halacha, but also, by the way, this happened. Not much like in the history of the Jewish people, this actually happened. That is a very powerful proof to this particular statement. Incredible. So the Gemara goes weiter. So the Gemara challenges this. Meisvei tumtum shekidesh kidusho pasol mipneshu safek arel va'arel pasol kadesh. Okay, so we'll say now we're going to go through. We're going to expand this list a little bit. So here we go. So the Gemara is like this. Tumtum. So remember again, we've spoken about tumtum a number of times. Membrane covering the sexual organs. We're not sure is he male or female. So we'll say if you have a tumtum who consecrated or sanctified the mechatos. So this is talking about a tumtum who made the mixture of the waters of the para aduma. Right? He made the waters. He poured in the water. So the Gemara says shekidesh kidusha pasal. Ultimately, again, what he has done, right? Rashi says over here, shekidesh is sheirev efer b'mayim. But let's say the act of what we call kiddush is the mixing of the ashes with the water. So if a tumtum mamish made the concoction, he made the mixture of the ashes and the water, it's pasul. Why? Because a tumtum is a safek arel, right? Because remember, again, listen to this. Remember, a tumtum is what, and at his essence, what is a tumtum? What is a tumtum? Safek yish, safek isha, right? So interestingly enough, in that safek, there's also, if he's an ish, he's also a what? He's also an orel. He's obviously uncircumcised. So it's very interesting. So in other words, we never, again, I think until you come to this Gemara, you don't think of tumtum as a safek orel. You just think of a tumtum as safek ish, safek isha. But now that the Gemara mentions it, it makes a lot of sense, because if he's a safek ish, by definition, he's an uncircumcised ish. An orel is not permitted to go ahead and make the mixture of para aduma, of the ashes with the water. So therefore, by definition, a tumtum is not permitted to do so as well. The androgynous shekidesh. What if an androgynous came along and made the mixture? So ultimately, again, kiddush kosher. That works. That works. Now, I'll say, why is it that works? Because halacha l'maisa, Rashi says over here, androgynous, mahul, shekidish, kiddush, kasher. I will say, remember, this is talking about an androgynous who has a bris. So we're going to see, Rashi says over here, sha'afilu isha kshir l'kadish l'rabbanan. So we'll say we're going to see, because halacha l'maisa, technically speaking, a woman is permitted to make the mixture of para aduma as well. So the androgynous, if he's a man, he's circumcised, we're good to go. If it's a woman, right? If she's a woman, then halacha l'maisa, she's permitted to make the mixture anyway. Rabbi Yehuda says, "Af androgynous shekidish kidusha psulin mipnei shesafek isha ve'isha psulim elakadesh." Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, an androgynous is not permitted to make the mixture for para aduma. Why? Because an androgynous is safek isha, and ultimately an isha is not permitted to go ahead and make the mixture. Good. So we'll say, so what we have over here is a fundamental machlokes. Now, interestingly enough, what's the machlokes in, Rabbi? What's the machlokes in? Really only, let's go through what we agree on. What does everyone agree on? That number one, tumtum can't go ahead and make the mixture of para aduma waters. Why not? The truth is, it's going to be a machlokes, why not? But at least everyone will agree that by definition, it's a suffix arel. Suffix arel, and an arel can't go ahead and make the concoction, can't make the mixture. Then there's a further machlokes. What about an androgynous? That Rabbanon say good, because either way, it's a circumcised man or a woman, and either one is okay to make the mixture. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, a woman is not permitted to make the mixture, and therefore, again, an androgynous cannot make the mixture. So Rabbi say, remember, leaving aside everything else, a very important piece of information came out of this, which is what? That an arel is not permitted to make the mixture of paraduma. Katani miha, arel, the suffix arel, pasal milakadish. So Rabbi say, what do you see from here? You see from here that an arel and even a suffix arel are not permitted to make the mixture of paraduma. And Rabbi say, this seems to pose a question to Rabbi Elazar, because we would assume if Rabbi Elazar is going to say that an arel is permitted to sprinkle the water, then what? Then what? He should be permitted to what? We would assume to mix it. And yet here the Brisa clearly explicitly says that he's not permitted to mix it. So what's going on over here? So Rabbi Yosef, Hai Tana de Rabbi Akiva. This particular Tana is a Tana of the Yeshiva of Rabbi Akiva. We'll say, by the way, what a schus to quote Rabbi Akiva on Lag BaOmer. Right? Absolutely incredible. Right? Tana de Rabbi Akiva. Demari Bose, by the way, I just want to point out also that Tana de Rabbi Akiva is also, again, remember the offspring is these are the Talmidim of the new five, right? Of the new five Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva, right? Not the 24,000 who perished. So here we're being quoted a teaching from someone who came out of the new five Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva, who when did Rabbi Akiva go ahead and establish or engage those five Talmidim? Today in Lag BaOmer. The Marbile Orel Kitame. Because ultimately, we'll say, so now what we're saying is like this. The author of this Brisa, who holds that halacha l'maisa and orel is not permitted to go ahead and do the mixture is from Rabbi Akiva's yeshiva, right? And there they held that an orel is like a tameh. Orel is treated like someone who is tameh. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says over here, Rabbi Akiva, Bereish Pirkin. Okay, fine. So we'll say, listen to this. The sign Rabbi Akiva Omer, Ish, l'rabos es ha'orel. Rabbi Akiva, remember again, Rabbi Akiva going back for just a couple of days, Rabbi Akiva didn't have the whole Gzera Shava of Tosha v'Sachir, but rather, again, his drasha was Ish to include the Orel. So Rabbi Akiva's model, an orel is like a tameh. So because of that halacha l'maisa, it makes sense that such a person would not be permitted to mix the waters of paraduma. So Amar Rava, suppose I fundamental machlokes. Amar Rava, Abi Yasivna kamed Rav Yosef v'kashili. So Rava says, I was going over all of this, and I was sitting before Rav Yosef, and I had the following question: Lo nishtamit tana v'lisnei ha'orel v'hatameh v'leima Rabbi Akiva. So we'll say, so why do we make this much simpler? Instead of going ahead and the Tana going ahead and discussing all of this, why not go ahead and say simply from the front end that ultimately this reflects the view of Rabbi Akiva, to which the Gemara says below, V'hakatani ha'arel v'hatame piturim minariyah. And we'll say what we have elsewhere, right? The statement, an arel and a tameh are pata from re'iyah. So we'll say, remember again, re'iyah is the mitzvah to go to the Beis HaMikdash, right? The mitzvah of Aliyah L'Regel. Actually, I take that back. The mitzvah of re'iyah ultimately is to be seen in the Beis HaMikdash and ultimately to bring your olas re'iyah. So the Gemara says that an arel and a tameh are pata from re'iyah. Also from our Chagiga days we had this. Hasam mishum dema'is. We'll say there it's different. There it's not a din in tumah, it's a din in mios. So we'll say ma'is literally means like disgusting. The arel and the tameh are considered to be ma'os, and therefore that's why they should not appear in the mikdash. But it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with tumah per se. And I will say they both go according to their reasoning. Rabbi say, look at Rashi for just a moment. Who are we talking about now? Rashi says, Rabbi Yehuda v'Rabbanan de'iflugu le'el ba'adrogena. So we'll say, so now we're going back for a second. If you remember again in the Brisa, we had the machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanan about androgynous. Remember again, the Rabbanan say an androgynous is permitted to go ahead and mix the waters of para aduma. Why? Because according to the Rabbanan, here's what the thing with androgynous is either it's male or it's female. The good news is, if it's male, it's what? It's what? It's a circumcised male. So according to the Rabbanan, you're good either way, because halacha l'maisa, the Rabbanan hold that both men and women are permitted to go ahead and mix the waters of paraduma. Rabbi Yehuda is the one who said androgynous is not permitted to mix the waters, because androgynous is suffix isha, and a isha, a woman, is not permitted to mix the waters. So says the Gemara, let's talk about this machlokes. Va'azlu tamahu tisanya. Here we go. Hakol ksherim lekadesh chutz mecherish shoteh v'katan. The Rabbanan, Rabbi the Tanna Kama holds that everyone is permitted to mix the waters of paraduma except for a cherish, shoteh, and a katan. Right? Except for, again, Rabbi say this group that is generally considered to lack capacity. Deaf mute, an insane person, and a katan. Rabbi Yehuda machshir b'katan, uposal b'isha. Rabbi Yehuda ultimately says that a katan is kosher, but he says that a woman is not permitted to mix the waters. Uba androgynous, so the Gemara says, my time with Rabbanan. So ultimately, again, uposal b'isha uba androgynous. And Rabbi Yehuda says that Rabbi Yehuda machshir b'katan. Rabbi Yehuda says a child can do it. Uposal b'isha uba androgynous. But ultimately says that a woman and androgynous can't. So we'll say, so let's analyze this machlokes. So let's zero in. Fundamental machlokes is a woman permitted to go ahead and mix the waters of the para aduma? Rabbanan, yes. Rabbi Yehuda, no. So my time with Rabbanan, let's analyze it. We'll say, why is this? What is at the core of this dispute? So we'll say, so the pasuk says, they will take for the person who is tamei from the ashes of the para. Chatas over here is the paraduma, from the ashes of the para. And the rest of the pasuk says, me'afar sreifas hachatas v'nasan alav Mayim Chayim El Keli. So we'll say, so this is the pasuk that describes taking the ashes and mixing it with water. Okay, so the Gemara says, Hanach de pasli ba'asifa psulin b'kiddush. Hanach de ksherin ba'asifa ksherin b'kiddush. So we'll say, the Rabbanon hold like this. They hold that the pasuk is creating a linkage. What's the linkage? The linkage is between v'lakchu, which is collecting the ashes, and v'nasan, and placing of the water. Whoever is permitted to collect the ashes is permitted to go ahead and make the mixture. But say, take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says over here, "V'lakchu latame basar asifas afrad da'haksiv avoda dekiddush ve'ein avoda mafsekes b'neim." So therefore, I will say, ultimately, again, we have the collection of the ashes, and then the mixture of the ashes. So the Rabbanan's model is, if you're permitted to collect, you're permitted to mix. Ultimately, again, Hanach tiksher ba'asiva ksher b'kiddush. Let's say, take a look at Rashi. Hanach te psulim ba'asiva psulim b'kiddush v'hasam darshinon v'asaf ish v'lo katan. Tahar lahachshir esa isha. So we'll say, the Gemara doesn't mention this, but Rashi fills in the blank over here. So how does that help us? Because listen to this. The Rabbanan darshan as follows. The pasuk says, v'asaf ish tahar. So right, v'asaf ish tahar. So we break this up. Ish teaches us that it has to be an adult and it can't be a minor. Tahar teaches us that it must be someone ritually pure, even if it's a woman. So we'll say, so again, this is like a double-decker drasha, right? So the first part of the drasha is there's a connection between the collector and the mixer. If you're permitted to go out and collect, right, and collect the ashes, you're permitted to mix them. And then who collects? Va'asaf ish tahar. It'll be an ish who is ritually pure. From ish we darshan adult and not a minor. Katan is excluded. Tahar, we go ahead and we darshan that halacha l'maisa, anyone who's tahar, even a woman, is permitted to go ahead and do the mixture. Incredible. What about Rabbi Yehuda? Rabbi Yehuda will say, Imkein nemakra v'lakach. If that's the case, why doesn't the pasuk just phrase it in the singular? Right? Just say v'lakach. Rashi says Imkein dahu asifa naket legabi mekadesh lichtov v'lakach latame kiechli dekasa ba'asifa va'asaf lashon yachid. Why doesn't it? Why is it v'lakchu and v'asaf? Why not v'lakach? My v'lakach. So we'll say See, Rabbi Huda's fixated is, if you really want to make a connection between the collector and the mixer, then it should be phrased in the same way. Then it says va'asaf ishtar, but here it says v'lakchu latame. So why doesn't it say v'asaf v'lakach? So the Gemara says, my v'lakchu, what does v'lakchu mean? Lakchu Rabbosai means even a larger group. Listen to this. Da'afilu hanach de psulin hasam ksherem hacha. Wow. To teach me that even those who are not fit for the asifa, even those who are not permitted to collect the ashes, are permitted to go ahead and mix the ashes. So the Gemara says, Ihachi, if that's Kiswase, so who's an example of that? An example according to Rabbi Yehuda is a katan. A katan, a minor, is not permitted to collect the ashes, but according to Rabbi Yehuda, a minor would be permitted to mix the ashes. Ihachi, isha nami. If that's the case, then why don't we include an isha as well? V'nasan below v'nasna. Rabbi Yehuda will darshan, the pasuk says v'nasan. Nasan is masculine, and it doesn't say v'nasna, which tells you that it has to be a man who mixes the ashes and not a woman. So it says the Gemara, v'rabanan iksiv v'lakach v'nasan. So the Rabbanan, what do you do with the fact that it goes from v'lakach to, right, iksiv v'lakach v'nasan, hava amina, shakil chad v'yav chad. I might have thought that it has to be one person who has to take the ashes, one person who has to mix the ashes. Kasav rachmana v'lakchu. Therefore the pasuk says, they shall take. Because of Rachmana v'lakchu v'nasnu hava amina the shakli trei v'yavi trei. And if it would have said v'lakchu v'nasnu, I would have thought you need two people to take it, two people to mix it. Because of Rachmana v'lakchu v'nasan dafilu shakli trei. Even if two people took it, v'yav chad, one person could still go ahead and mix it. Good. So I'll say. So therefore, this is the fundamental. This is the fundamental machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanon, ultimately again about the parameters of who is permitted to go ahead and mix the waters of the para aduma. Rabbi say at the end of the day, interesting. Well, we'll see how the Rambam paskins. Top of Ayin Gimel. So we'll say now we're just continuing to go ahead and darshan the psukim. V'hiza hatar ala tameh. So we'll say so. Still in para aduma, what does the Torah say? Someone who is tahar will go ahead and sprinkle on the person who is tameh. Remember again, on the third day and on the seventh day. That is what is required. So we'll say, so just by the way, just as we're kind of continuing along, just keep in mind the fundamental machloksim we have. We have Rabbi Elazar who's saying that an arel is permitted to go ahead and sprinkle the ashes of the para aduma. He's permitted to be the sprinkler, right? Okay, we have that. That doesn't seem to be machlokis as much as the Gemara tries to challenge it. Fine. Then we have the machlokis Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanon about who is fit ultimately to go ahead and do the mixing of the waters of the para aduma. You have the Rabbanon that essentially say everyone is permitted to go ahead and do it, except ultimately for Hakol Kshem Chutz Michirish Shotev a Katan, right? But Rabbanon included Isha, and Rabbi Yehuda says that a Katan can do it, an Isha can't do it. Okay, so just hold on to these machloksim so far. Tabavayin Gimel. So the pasuk says the person who is tahar will sprinkle the waters of the paradum, and the person who's tamei, tahar michlal shehu tamei. I will say this is such a fascinating drasha. So the fact that the Torah goes out of its way to say tahar over here, the Gemara interprets as meaning this person is tahar for matters of para aduma, but he may be considered tamei for other situations. Okay? Where can you have a situation of a person who's tahar, right? For para aduma, but tamei for other situations? Limeid atvul yom shekasher bepara. Oh, I will say, what's an example of that? A person who's kasher for para, but tamei in other circumstances? Tvul yom. We'll see, we spoke about this before. By the way, do you remember when we first saw this Gemara? Remember we first saw this Gemara about Tvul Yom by Para Aduma? Remember? Daf Beis in Yuma. Remember again, this was the first time that we were introduced to this sugya, where Beis with Beis, the Gemara spoke about the fact that clay gilalim they used to use, again, these earthenware utensils of Para Aduma, they would dafka be metame, the Kohen, who would do the part, they would dafka be metame him. Right, they'd be metame him, then take him to the mikvah, and when he was a tvul yom, he would do the service of the pardon. But why? Lahotse miliban shal tzdukim, because the tzdukim did not believe that a tvul yom could go out and do paraduma. And remember again, this was like the counterbalance. We were makel with tvul yom, and they were very machmir with other areas of para aduma to kind of balance things a little bit. In any event, so I will say the idea that we go out of our way to call him a tahar indicates us that halacha lemaisa he's a tahar for this situation, maybe tummy for other situations, to teach us that a tvul yom is permitted to do para aduma. So Bamin and Sheshes Aram. So I will say now we're transitioning. So we'll say, by the way, how do we pass the halacha lemaisa? So halacha lemaisa we pass like Rabbi Lazar, namely that an aral is permitted, Kohen aral is permitted to do the sprinkling of the para aduma. What about in the other discussion? We pass like the Rabbanan. The halacha lemaisa, when it comes to the mixing of the waters, everyone is permitted to do so, right? Even a woman, an aral. The only exception is cheresh shota v'katan. Cheresh shota v'katan. We pass like the Rabbanan. Good. Let's go weiter. Aral malba meiser. What's the interesting case? Is an aral permitted to eat meiser sheni? Well, remember again, meiser sheni is the time that you separate out from your produce. That halacha meiser you have to bring up to Yerushalayim and you consume it. It's yours to consume. So is an aral permitted to eat meiser sheni? So let's analyze this. So do we say ki heichidi yolif pesach mi meiser le'inyan aninos yolif nami mi meiser mi pesach le'inyan arelos? Why don't we say the following? The same way that we learn out that Korban Pesach from meiser sheni in terms of aninos, that just like an onen can't eat meiser sheni, so to an onen can't eat Pesach. Why don't we say the flip? Why don't we say the flip side? And to say that we'll learn out meiser from Pesach, that just like again, by Korban Pesach, an Arel can't eat Korban Pesach, so to an Arel can't eat meiser sheni. Okay? Sounds like good limud. Here's the problem. Odilma, chamer mikal yolif, kal mi chamer lo yolif. There's only one problem. Let's say in general, it's easy to learn out something stringent from something lenient, but not something lenient from something stringent. In other words, I was saying, so for example, to learn out from Meiser Sheni to Pesach, that ultimately, again, just like an onen can't eat Meiser Sheni, can't eat Pesach, that makes sense. Why? Because Korban Pesach is more chamer than Meiser Sheni. So if by Meiser Sheni an onen can't eat it, then certainly Korban Pesach an onen can't eat it. Conversely, you can't necessarily learn out that since an Arel can't eat Korban Pesach, that an Arel can't eat Meiser Sheni. Korban Pesach is more chomer. Maybe that's just the din in Korban Pesach that doesn't apply to Meiser Sheni. Amar lahu tinisua. We learned this. So again, simple shaila. Is an Arel permitted to eat Meiser Sheni? Right? That's the shaila. So I'm going to say tinisua. We learned this. Hachuma v'abikurim chayav nalei misa v'chomesh. Supposed to listen to this. If a non-Kohen goes ahead and consumes truma and bikurim, right? Both portions of the Kohen. Right? So if Yisrael consumes them, chayav nalei misa. If you do it intentionally, there's a chiyav misa. If you do it unintentionally, ultimately again chomesh. There's a penalty fifth. Right? You have to pay back the principal plus a penalty fifth. Vasur l'zarim. And obviously, again, these items are prohibited to a non-Kohen. Vehein nichse Kohen. And they are the property of the Kohen. Property of the Kohen. I will say, which means, what does it mean, property of the Kohen? So if a Kohen wanted to use them to be Mekadesh Nisha, to betroth the woman, he'll be permitted to do so. Listen to this. Va'olin be'echadumea. And Abba said they are bottle in a mixture of 100 to 1. And before you eat truma or bikurim, you need to wash your hands and feet. The hair of shemesh, and again, if you're tamei, you can't be a tvul yom, right? You have to have the sunset. You have to have the sunset in order to eat it. Hari ela b'trum bikurim. But say all of these are stringencies which apply to truma and bikurim. Mashe enkein b'meiser. I will say, but again, these stringencies do not apply to meiser sheni. Don't apply Meiser Sheni. So Rabbi say, now watch this. V'im Isa. The Rabbi say, if at the end of the day, Rashi V'im Isa, the Kal Mechamer Lo Yolif Umutter Al B'Meiser. And furthermore, I'm going to say, if it was true that ultimately, again, that an Arla was permitted to eat Meiser Sheni, then why not include in this list Nisni Arel Aser Bahem Masha Inkim B'Meiser? Why don't we also include in this list that an Arel is not permitted to eat Truma and Bikurim, but by Meiser Sheni it's permitted? So I will say the fact that that's not included seems to indicate what? That an Arel will be prohibited in Meiser Sheni as well as in Truma and Bikurim. And ultimately, again, I will say that Halacha L'Maisa, since it's not written, it would appear that again, Arel was prohibited to consume Meiser Sheni as well. To which the Gemara says, Tana V'Shir. It's not a complete list. Right? The Tana left off certain things from the list. So Rabbi say, now in order to give that answer, you have to demonstrate what's been left off. So the Gemara says, Umay Shir, Dahai Shir. So we'll say, what was left off from the list? So the Gemara says, Shir, the Katani Seifa, Yish, B'Meiser, Ubikurim, Masha Ein Kein B'Truma. That there are certain things that apply to Meiser and Bikurim that don't apply to Truma. For example, what? Shameiser v'abikurim tu'unin hava'as makom. Rabbi say Meiser and Bikurim require being brought to a particular place, right? So the Bikurim Rabbi says to the Mikdash, and ultimately Meiser Shen to Yerushalayim, u'tu'unin vidui, and they require confession. Va'asr la'onein, and then you're not permitted to eat an onein. Rabbi Shimon Matir, Rabbi Shimon says Bikurim can be consumed by an onein. V'chayavim bebir. And Rabbi say there's a din of beer. Rabbi is actually very interesting. If you look at Rashi, v'chayavim bebir, Rashi says Bikurim u'meiser sheni b'shana hashlishis. Bikurim and meiser sheni have a din of beer. Rabbi say beer means, remember again, this is when during the third year of the 7-year cycle, a person takes all of their tithes and gets them out of the house. Bi'arti hakodesh min habayis. I have removed all of the consecrated, sanctified items from my home. Rabbi Shimon says, they know halacha lamaisa, bikurim don't require beer. V'ilu asr leva'er mehen betuma. And I will say ultimately, again, look at Rashi just a moment. V'ilu asr leva'er mehen betuma. I will say this idea that you can't look at Rashi. I'm sorry. V'ilu isra asr leva'er mehen betuma. The Tanakama de Makish b'kol meiser shein v'kol mili havile lemisni va'asr lahalik mehem enitmu de'ein tumasan matirin lahavara. So Rabbi says, we're going to see in just a moment, according to the Tanakama, who goes ahead and compares, right, Bikurim to Meiser for everything, he should say that halacha lamaisa, you are not permitted to go ahead and burn them and get use of them in a state of tumah. Right? So this statement is not included. V'ilu asr levar mem mituma, amad beis, va'ochlin bitumas atzman, loke, masha ein kein mitruma. And I will say furthermore again, Ochlan betumas atzman. I will say we're going to see this is actually an interesting case. The case of Ochlan betumas atzman, I will say, refers to a case where the person is tahar, but the item, the truma bikurim, is in a state of tuma. If a person goes in, a kohen goes in and eats these items, he's tahar, but the items are tameh, loke. Ultimately, you get malchus. Masha'in came with truma. And I will say these are halachas that apply to bikurim, but don't apply to truma. And I will say, ultimately, Rashi says over here, because by truma, she'ekim truma, de'eno musharba, ela b'tumas haguf. I will say, this is actually very interesting. By truma, there is technically no prohibition to consume truma that is tameh. Right? So to eat truma tameya in a person that is star, that wouldn't, there's no particular isra with that. The only isra applies when the person himself is tameh. I will say, what's the point? The point over here is that there are many other things that could have been included in the list that were not. So therefore, by definition, because of that, then halacha l'maisa, you can't go ahead and have a raya. You can't have a raya to say that the list itself is exhaustive. Say, Rabbi will say, we'll pause here for just a moment because let's go back, because the Gemara now is going to dissect this brisa that we just quoted. So we'll say, remember again, we had a very simple shaila. What was our very simple shaila? Our simple shaila is an orel permitted to go ahead and eat meiser sheni? Right? I will say that was our fundamental issue. So I will say, interestingly enough, the halacha is we paskin that an orel is not permitted to eat meiser sheni, and in fact, interestingly enough, it's learned out from Pesach. That's actually where they learn it out from. Just because there is a connection between Meiser Sheni and Pesach, just like an Arel is not permitted to eat, just like an Arel is not permitted to eat Korban Pesach, so too an Arel is not permitted to consume Meiser Sheni. Good. That's the halacha l'maisa. Now, Rabbi, we're going to go back and do a deep dive into this brisa. So here we go. Rabbi say, Ayin Gimel Amud Beis, third line down. Va'asur la'onin. So we said again in the brisa, Meiser Sheni, and Bikurim are not permitted to an onin. Only is not permitted to eat these items. By the way, I'll point out, you say to yourself, okay, so what's the big deal? But if you think about this, by the way, if you're a Kohen, right? So remember again, these were the items through which you sustained yourself. So the idea that obviously people become an onein, Rahman al-Islan. So the idea that as an onein, you would have to be careful. I mean, Meiser Sheni is for everyone, but Bikurim is for the Kohen. So halacha l'maisa again, whether it's your Meiser Sheni or Bikurim, you can't consume it as an onein. Rabbi Shimon Mati. Rabbi Shimon says that an onein is permitted to eat Bikurim. So we'll say Rabbi Shimon doesn't argue on Meiser Sheni. Right? He argues on Bikurim. Bikurim can be consumed by an onein. So Minalahu, ultimately, again, we'll say, we're asking Rabbi Shimon, from where do you know that Bikurim are permitted to an onein? Dichsiv, lo sucha le'echol b'sharecha, ma'asar digancha v'siroshcha v'yitzarecha. We'll say, the pasuk says, you shall not eat within your own gates the meiser of your grain, your olives, and your grapes. Utshumas yadcha. So we'll say, so again, the pasuk the Gemara is quoting over here is, lo sucha le'echol b'sharecha, ma'asar digancha v'siroshcha v'yitzarecha, u'b'choros pekarecha v'tzonecha, v'chol nedarecha asher tidar nidvosecha, u'trumas yadecha. Okay, so we'll say, so the Torah is here telling me, you're not allowed to eat consecrated items in your own home. Consecrated items must be consumed in Yerushalayim. You know, where in Yerushalayim exactly depends on the nature of the sanctity of the item. So the Gemara says, now, what's that last phrase, u'trumas yadecha? What does that mean? V'amar, trumas yadecha elu bikurim. Oh, we'll say trumas yadecha refers to bikurim. Bikurim. Ve'iskish bikurim l'maiser. And now you see that bikurim is compared to maiser. Ma maiser asr la'onein. Af bikurim asr la'onein. Just like maiser cannot be consumed by an onein, so to bikurim can't be consumed by an onein. So Rabbi Shimon who says that bikurim can be consumed by an onein, where does he get his idea from? Rabbi Shimon, truma karin rabbanan. I will say Rabbi Shimon says it might be true that trumas yadecha, right, or trumas yadecha is bikurim, but lamaisa the Torah calls bikurim truma. And what does that tell me? Ma truma muteres la'onein, af bikurim muter la'onein. And it teaches me a very important yesod, which is, just as truma is muter to an onein, so to bikurim is muter to an onein as well. V'chayovin bebir. So we'll say, so therefore again, that's the source of machlokes. That's machlokes number one. Can an onein eat bikurim? Rabbanan, yes. Rabbi Shimon, no. And again, based on the drasha of the same exact pasuk. Incredible. V'chayavim bebir. And ultimately, again, these items are subject to the din of beer. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Shimon poter. Rabbi Shimon says you're poter. Once again, mar makish. So the Tanakama will go ahead and compare bikurim to meiser. And ultimately, mar, Rabbi Shimon does not make the hekish. Fine. Va'asr levar mehen betuma, va'ochlon betumas atzmon. So the Gemara says, look, yeah. So now we'll say two pieces of the brisa. We're just dissecting the brisa. So remember again, next piece was asr levar mehen betuma, which Rabbi say means halacha lemaisa. You cannot burn them, get benefits from burning them when they are in a state of tuma. But it is referring to meiser sheni and bikurim. And if you eat them, va'ochlon betumas atzmon. Rabbi say, so again, remember, ochlon betumas atzmon is the case where you are tahar, but the items are tameh. If you consume them in that case, you get malchus. So from where do we know this? Minalan. Rabbi Shimon says, lo bi'arti mimenu b'tameh. I have not gone ahead and burnt it in a state of tumah. Bein sha'ani tameh v'hu tahar. Bein sha'ani tar v'hu tameh. Whether ultimately, so what does this mean? And again, whether I am tameh and the items are tahar, or whether I am tahar and the items are tameh. So the Gemara says, but from where do we know ultimately again that a person is precluded from eating these items as well? This is actually interesting. Rabbi Shimon says, I'm not sure. I don't know where it comes from. Tumas Haguf. So let's analyze this. So Tumas Haguf, behejek sibe. So we'll say Tumas Haguf is explicitly mentioned. Rabbi say that the idea that halacha lamaisa, tumas haguf, which means again a person is in a state of ritual impurity, right? That idea that halacha lamaisa, the person himself is tameh, and therefore he can't consume these items. Where halacha lamaisa does that come from? Tumas haguf behejek. That's stated explicitly. The Gemara says, what does it say? Nefesh asher tigabo v'tama ada erev. So both say the idea that someone who has tamei tumas haguf, the idea that that person is not permitted to go ahead and eat any of these items, That's obvious, right? That's a mefurish pasuk. Nefesh asher tiga bo, a nefesh which becomes tamei through contact with a nefesh that becomes tamei through contact with a davar hatamei, ultimately becomes tamei ad erev and cannot eat from hakadashim, from the consecrated items. Kim rachatz b'sra b'mayim. To which the Gemara says, no, here's the shaila. Tumas atzmo minayin. They will say, well, the idea that I'm not allowed to eat whatever you fill in the blank, truma, bikurim, meiser sheni. When I am tamei, that everyone knows. That's a pasuk. What do I want to know? Tumas atzmo. They will say, what I want to know about is in the case of where the person is tahar, but ultimately the item, fill in the blank, truma, bikurim, meiser sheni. When the item is tamei, how do I know that consumption is prohibited in that case? Minayin. Talmud lomar lo sucha le'echol b'sharecha ma'asar digancha. So I'll say the pasuk says, listen to this. You are not permitted to eat within your gates. Right, ma'asar digancha, right, ma'asar, or any of the tithes to that matter. Ulalanu omer b'sharecha tochlanu hatamei v'hatahar yachdav kitzvi v'chayal. Now watch this. We have another pasuk. The pasuk says, you may eat it within your gates, right? You may eat it within your gates, the tamei and the tar together. Now, what is that referring to? If you take a look at Rashi says, B'sharach tochlanu, b'psuli hamukdoshin koi, la'achar pidyonon sha'oklan zar. So I will say, this is talking about, again, cases of sacrificial animals which developed a mum and were redeemed. What we call psuli hamukdoshin, right? So I will say, so again, so these, what can you do with these items? So interestingly enough, once they've been redeemed, they no longer have any sanctity, and therefore halacha l'maisa, you could eat it even within your gates. Tar, tamei, it doesn't matter. But say the pasuk in its entirety is b'sharecha tochlanu hatamei v'hatar yachtav katzvi v'cha'ayal. So what is this referring to? So the Gemara says, "V'tani debei Rabbi Shmuel afilu tamei v'tahar ochlin al shulchan echad b'kara achos ve'inon choshishin." Now, the paradigmatic example of this that Rashi brings down is Bechar Behema. Right? So, for example, Bechar Behema, right? Bechar Behema Tahora, firstborn kosher animal, has sanctity, right? Remember again, who gets the firstborn kosher animal? It goes to the Kohen. What if it has a mum? Who keeps it? The owner. What can you do with it? Anything you want. You want to shecht it, have a barbecue, invite over all of your tamei friends. No problem. Right? No problem. Everybody can consume it together, eat together. It's not a problem. So the Gemara says, listen to this. The Torah says, "Hahu da'amri lecha hasam b'sharecha tochlanu." But it's only in that case, psuli hamukdashin, right? Redeemed, blemished sacrificial animals, or redeemed bechor animal. That's when you can eat it in your gates, in your home, to horim and tamim together. However, hacha by meiser sheni lo seichel. By meiser sheni, ultimately, again, it would not be permitted. But take a look at Rashi. Hahu b'sharecha dahasam dekashari leilatar laochlo achar shenaga tami bekara v'nitma'a kaminu lacha hacha meiser latocha. Both say, here's the chiddush in this case. Both say, let's play this out. Right? I have, let's say again, Ami Yisrael. I have a firstborn animal. Okay, I'm going to give it to the Kohen, but through no fault of my own or through no intentional infliction of a wound, right? The animal gets injured, right? Animal has a mum. So what happens now? I keep it. So I say, Torah tells me, what do I have to do with it? Anything I want. So literally, again, I shecht it. I have my friends over eating. I know some of my friends are tamei. Now let's say again, to build achdos, what do? We just have one big platter of meat. Right? Nothing builds bonds of unity like one big platter of meat, you and all of your friends sitting around. But let's say, what happens the moment that your tamei friend touches that platter? What happens? Everything becomes tamei. So we'll say, interestingly enough, what this now becomes is a situation of me, someone who is tahar, consuming an item that is tamei. And what does the Torah have to say about that? What does the Torah have to say about that? No problem. Go ahead. It's not a big deal. The Gemara Darshans over here, it's tafka in that case where you, being someone who's ritually pure, eating something that is tamei is not a problem. But the Gemara says, hacha, in the case of meiser sheni, lo seichel. We would not want you to do that. Okay, so both say, so therefore again, you have essentially like three different cases. Case number one, which is the obvious case, where the person is tamei person can't eat anything that has consecration associated with it. Second, right, the other case is where I had a consecrated sacrificial item that was blemished, redeemed, now it becomes chulin. You can do whatever you want with it. Third case, which is the more complicated case, is I am tahar. The consecrated item is tameh. What can I do with it? To which the Gemara says, in that case, in Meiser Sheni, Bikurim, Truma, ultimately, again, one would not be permitted to go ahead and consume it. Incredible. Masha Enki Truma. I shouldn't jump the gun to Truma. Right now, that was just with Meiser Sheni. What about Truma? So now the Gemara Brisa goes, Masha Enki Truma. So we'll say, Salach Maisa. When it comes to Truma, right, you can't burn Truma in a way in which you're going to get benefit from it. So Menadlan, where do we know this from? Rabbi Yevamos, Rabbi Yochanan, Amar Kra, Lo bi'arti mimenu bitamei. So I will say, ultimately, again, I did not burn Meiser Sheni that was tamei for myself. Mimenu iyata mavir. You can't do that for Meiser Sheni. Aval ata mavir shemen shel truma shenitma. But I will say, if you have truma, so for Meiser Sheni, you can't burn. If it became tamei, you can't burn away from which you get benefit. But halacha l'maisa, by let's say you have oil of truma that became tamei, you can burn it in a way that gives you benefit. So the Gemara says, "Ve'ema mimenu iyatamavi aval atamavi shemen shel kodesh shenitma." Maybe you should say the following: from Meiser Sheni, you can't get benefit if you're burning it, if it's tamei, but you could burn shemen shel kodesh, right? Consecrated oil that became tamei. Lav kavachomer. The Gemara says, "Isn't this kavachomer?" Uma Meiser kal amar Torah lo bi'arti mena betamei. So say if it comes to Meiser Sheni, we'll say Meiser Sheni is considered to be the most lenient of items, and yet halacha l'maisa again by Meiser Hakal, the Torah says that I did not go ahead and burn it. Once it was tamei, I didn't get benefit from burning tamei Meiser Sheni. So kodesh chamer lakol sheken. If that applies to Meiser Sheni, then halachas kama v'kama will apply to kodesh. Ihachi, if that's the case, truma nami kavachomer. Truma should also be a kavachomer. To which the Gemara says haksiv mimenu. Torah says mimenu. It only applies ultimately to Meiser Sheni. Umarois, so we'll say, I don't understand. How do you know what to include, what to exclude? Mistabra kodesh lo mematina shekain pinak kas. We'll say it makes sense to say that kodesh would not be excluded from this prohibition. Why? Because halacha l'maisa kodesh has all of these stringencies. What are all the stringencies of kodesh? Pigul. Right, so we'll say, so again, pigul, which we know, right? Again, remember, pigul, again, the halacha being that a coin has a disqualifying thought, ultimately could invalidate the carbon. No, sir. If it's left over past its prescribed time, carbon, it has the status of a carbon, mi'ila, subject to prohibited use. Kares, if willful violation, va'asr la'onein. And ultimately, again, it's asr to an onein. To which the Gemara says, okay, adarabba, that's all kodesh. Truma lo matina. So we'll say if that's the case, I could also say that truma should also not be excluded because truma also has its own chumras. Shekain machpaz. There's machpaz. What's machpaz? I will say misa chomesh. Right, subject to death if you intentionally, if a non-Kohen intentionally eats truma, chomesh, if you unintentionally consume it, ultimately, again, there's an additional penalty. Fifth, ve'im lepeyon, cannot be redeemed, vasru lezarim, and ultimately it is prohibited to non-Kohanim. To which the Gemara says, you're right, but hanach nefishin, there are more chumras by kodesh than there are by truma. By saying the other possibility is even without the additional stringencies, ultimately kares adifa. Ultimately, again, kares is considered to be more severe. So we'll say what the Gemara is trying to prove over here is that halacha l'may says follows: that it's only by truma that ultimately, if it becomes tamei, one is not permitted to go ahead and burn it in a way that one gets hana'ah from it. Interestingly enough, because I will say the idea over here is, masha'en came with truma, right? That truma halacha l'maisa, one would be permitted to go ahead and burn it in a way from which one gets benefit from it, because again, it only applies to the stringent items mentioned over here. Because the pasuk, when it's lo bi'arti mimenu b'tamei, ultimately, again, halacha l'maisa is talking about Meiser Sheni. So it's only Meiser Sheni that you're not permitted to burn in a way that gives you benefit. But halacha l'maisa, you can go ahead and burn shemen shel truma that became tamei. So I'll say the Gemara was just trying to figure out, ultimately, again, why is it truma that's excluded, but kodesh that's not? And the Gemara goes through the exercise. Well, so we'll stop over here for today. I'll just use the last few minutes we have just to reference a little bit about the beautiful and holy nature of Lag BaOmer. So also we know that today, I'm sorry. So we know that today, Lag BaOmer is special for so many different reasons. And has Kedusha associated with it. We spoke about this last night a little bit at the Medura, at the bonfire as well. But of course, on the most notable level, that today is the yahrzeit of the Tana Eloki. Today is the yahrzeit of Rabbi Shmuel Bar Yochai. Rabbi Shmuel Bar Yochai was special for so many reasons. And most often we understand that the power of today, the yahrzeit of Rabbi Shmuel Bar Yochai, is because it was on this day, his last day of his life, Rabbi Shmuel Bar Yochai conveyed what became known as the Idra the Idra Rabbah, that on this day, Rabbi Shmuel Bar Yochai gave over to his students what we call today Jewish mysticism, right? The esoteric body of Torah knowledge, right? Kabbalah, Zohar, Idra Idra Rabbah, all of that Rabbi Shmuel Bar Yochai held in his heart, but then gave it over to his students. But I'll tell you something else, another lesson of Rashbi, which is so incredibly important. You know, there's a beautiful Gemara Maseches Sukkah. The Gemara in Daf Mem Hamad Bey says, Amar Rashbi, Rabbi Shmuel Bar Yochai says, Yachal ani liftar es kol ha'olam min hadin. Ultimately, again, I could exempt the entire world from judgment. I could exempt the entire world. I can go ahead and literally cause everyone to be free from judgment, right? How could I do that? So the Gemara says, Miyom shenivrei siat ata. So Rabbi Shmuel Bar Yochai says, literally, I have the ability, he sounds like he's saying, through me, to carry the weight of the sin of the entire world and to exempt all of mankind from judgment. So I'll say, it's a very strong statement. How does Rabbi Shmuel Bar Yochai do that? So I'll say, I would draw your attention to another Gemara, the famous Gemara Masechah Shabbos. The Gemara in Shabbos, Daf Lamed Gimel Amud Beis, Lag, right? Lag Amud Beis. I will say, it's a story of Rabbi Shmuel, it's a good way to remember. The story of Rabbi Shmuel Bar Yochai and Rabbi Lazar in the cave is on Daf Lag. Is on Daf Lamed Gimel. It's incredible. So Rabbi say, you know the story, they were in the cave, they came out of the cave. The first time they came out of the cave wasn't so good. Everywhere they looked, they destroyed. The second time they came out of the cave, the Gemara says that Rabbi Shimon and his son Rabbi Lazar couldn't believe that people were working. They had lived such a kaddish and esoteric life that they couldn't believe that people were spending time in mundane matters. And everywhere they looked, they destroyed. Everywhere they looked, they destroyed. So that was the first time. Then they were sent back into the cave. The second time they come out. And what happens? They see, it's Erev Shabbos, and they see an old man running with 2 bundles of myrtle branches. And Rabbi Shmuel Bar Yochai says to the man, he says, why are you running with why 2 bundles of myrtle branches? And the old man said, Echad kineged zachar, but echad kineged shamar. One ultimately again for zachar, one for shamar. And Rabbi Shimon turns to Rabbi Lazar and he says to his son, Amar le librei, kama chavivin mitzvos Yisrael. You see how much Klal Yisrael loves mitzvos. Klal Yisrael loves mitzvos. And I will say, what was happening during that exchange is everywhere Rabbi Lazar looked, Rabbi Lazar saw people who were shirking their spiritual responsibilities and totally immersed in mundane day-to-day life. And what Rashbi saw this old man carrying 2 bundles, rushing home from work, carrying 2 bundles. And he said to his sons, Kama chaviv in mitzvos Yisrael. Look how much Klal Yisrael loves mitzvos. And I will say what was happening in that moment, was Rashbi exhibiting incredible avas Yisrael. Was Rashbi showing his son that if you want to be a member of Klal Yisrael, you have to see the good. You have to see the positive. It is easy to look at people and to see what is broken. It is easy to look at people and to see that which is damaged and in a state of disrepair. But if you want to really lift up Klal Yisrael, if you want to really move the needle for Klal Yisrael, if you really want to do something, it is all about Avas Yisrael. And it's all about seeing the good. It is so easy and it is so tempting. And sometimes it actually feels so good to tear people down. But what happens when we tear each other down? What happens when we disrespect each other? What happens when it's lo nagu kavod zeh lazeh? Klal Yisrael is decimated. Klal Yisrael is torn apart. Kama chavivin. Rabbi Shmuel Bar Yochai says, Rabbi Lazar, stop being such a purist. Stop looking for perfection. See the good in the simple Jew who's running home on Erev Shabbos with 2 bundles of myrtle branches. That's our avoda. And I think that's the pshat. When Rashbi says, Yochol ani liftaras kol ha'olam min adin, I can save the entire world from judgment. What do you mean you can save the entire world from judgment? Rashbi says, it's not me, but this idea that I tried to convey to my son of Avas Yisrael, of seeing the good, of loving every Jew. That's what saves the world from judgment. That's what saves the world from judgment. I was saying, it's Lag BaOmer, and we have the Yartzeit of Rashbi, Rabbi Akiva's 5 new students, a day of such koach, and it's a day that we have to recommit ourselves to Avas Yisrael. We have disagreements, we have differences of opinion, we have this, we have that, whether it's within our families, within our shul, within a greater kila, within a community, within an am. It's time to set it aside. Rashbi tells us, if you want to save Klal Yisrael from din, it's all about kama chaviv and mitzvos al bnei Yisrael. It's all about Avas Yisrael. And if each of us could just take upon ourselves on this Lag BaOmer to love our fellow Jew just a little bit more, then the light of the Lag BaOmers of bonfire will catch, right? And the bonfires of Lag BaOmer, that light will Amir Hashem turn into a raging fire of Avas Yisrael. And a raging fire of Avas Yisrael will Amir Hashem turn into the raging fire of Mashiach Mihira B'Yameinu. Amen. Right, we'll say have a great day, everyone. Shkach, everyone.